Well, thanks so much, Sam and Boulder Academy for inviting me to do this. I should just say as well, apologising in advance for various things. I mean, if you are a PGC student from IOE, you may well have seen most of this before. If you were at the Prince's Trust in December, you will have done. So apologies to anybody who's, well, maybe not apologies, maybe it's good to have it again, I don't know. But so, I mean, this is relatively impromptu. Sam and I, hatched this plan not long ago. So what I've done is I've just brought out my standard interpretations presentation, really. I'm just going to do the thing I usually do. And actually looking through it as I began to reflect on this yesterday, I think I probably need to update this in a number of ways. So this is just some ideas, I think, which I hope may be useful to you on teaching interpretation. It by no means attempts to be comprehensive. I'm not trying to cover everything, and certainly not exclusive. I don't in any way want to say that what I'm proposing here is how you should do it. It's just how I do it. There are lots of other things I would do as well. Obviously, one can't say everything in one presentation. So what we've really got is some ideas that will help students deconstruct narratives. I don't know if it's the same for you as it is for me, but some of this PowerPoint is disappearing behind cameras. So I apologise for that if that's happened to you, but we'll just have to cope, I think, won't we? This is the first time I've done this on Zoom, so if it doesn't work, I apologise. Okay, that's all the caveats and apologies out of the way. Let's get on with it then. So this presentation is trying to do a number of things, really. Just talk about what interpretation is, how it's different from working with evidence, let's say. And what I'm drawing on when I'm talking about these things is partly my own experience, because I was a history teacher for 12 years on and off, but also as well on research. Now, I don't mean by that to claim that everything in this presentation is, science, okay? What I mean by that is it's the result of reflection and research. So I'll be using quotes from some of my research on interpretations over the years. And what have I done? I'm not a historian. I was a history teacher. I've got a degree in history and a degree in social science and a doctorate in education. But my speciality in my doctorate was children's thinking. Okay, so when I say that it's based on research, what I mean by that is there's material here drawing on research into kids thinking about interpretation. Okay, let's get on with it. So the first question, I'm sorry it's slightly obscured by the films there or the cameras, is what are interpretations and how does it differ from other things? What I want to start by doing is just talking about how the curriculum frames things. In a way, this is slightly problematic because everyday life and normal discourse is in some way in conflict with the curriculum. We want to distinguish in history very tightly between interpretation and evidence. And that's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it, though? Because in ordinary life, you would talk regularly and routinely about interpreting the evidence. So we want to put this this kind of clear line or clear cut between two things which sometimes seem to overlap. And I think it's important to bear that in mind because it's easy to slip between one and the other if you don't ask the question, how are they different? And it's also important to bear it in mind because kids will get confused as well. And I think we do need to be quite rigid in our thinking in lots of ways. Because it's quite easy to slip into the same language when you're dealing with both, which will cement kids' lack of awareness that we're trying to do slightly different things when we engage in interpretation and engage in evidence. So, for example, textbooks, sometimes even exam boards, certainly teachers, and I've done this myself, use the term source when we're talking about an interpretation, which is not the same thing, depending on how you frame your questions about it, of course. But when you talk about a source, really what you're talking about is a relic or a remain or a trace from the past, and we mean something different by interpretation. So I think we need to watch how we talk when we're talking to kids. Okay, so what is the difference? Now, I'm persuaded, I don't know whether you will be or whether you're able to entirely see this, of the usefulness of a model that Germans use when they talk about history didactics in Germany. And this is just explaining it. So how do we differentiate between evidence and interpretation? This is, I don't know if people recognize that, this is the only remaining Peterloo banner. So if you like, this is straight up historical evidence. It's a trace of the past. Though I guess actually, if you looked at it without any awareness of its history, to you, it would just be a faded piece of cloth in the present. But it's it's I think it's in Rochdale Museum. I hope I've got that right. And it is a relic of Peterloo, and also it's in a way, you can use it to try and interrogate that moment and ask questions about it. This is something which also relates to Peterloo and is also a relic. It's one of the books in which injuries were logged of those who'd been victims at the time. So when we talk about the past and representations of it, one of the things we're talking about are these relics which stand for the past and in a way are the remains of the past, albeit only partial and slight. As I said, that's the only Peterloo banner. But if we're talking about the other sorts of representations of Peterloo we might find in class, or we might use in history, this is another one which is slightly different. I mean, it's from 1819, the same time as Peterloo, but this is a retrospective look back at something that happened earlier in the year by the cartoonist Cruikshank. So it differs from the first item because this is one of the things that was there on the day. The second item is evidence of Peterloo, but it's also not directly from the time of the events. It wasn't there. It's recording the injuries people sustained there, but obviously not all of them because some of them are dead, not all will be coming forward and so on. But you can see already the diversity of kind of representations of the past. Some of these, of course, aren't representations in themselves; they're relics, but we use them to think about the past, so I'm going to call them representations. So far, we've got contemporary documents, we've got remains, we've got documents that are contemporary, and here we have an account or an attempt to give meaning and to spin a narrative around these events. And you could begin to work that out, from, let's say, what the people are saying as the yeomanry joyfully hack away at the women and children. They're obviously enjoying themselves. There's a narrative there. But we also talk about this kind of thing, don't we, when we talk about representations of the past. And this is an Oxford University tome that my friend Robert Poole produced last year, the fruit of 20 years' work, really. And this is an example of an academic monograph on Peterloo. So it's a very different kind of thing from the things we've been looking at so far. We also have a film brought out in 2018, I think in November, of Peterloo. So we're getting quite a catalogue so far, aren't we, of representations of it that we might use in the history classroom. And just to keep going with that, this is another thing that Robert was involved in that was produced last year, a graphic novel about Peterloo. And it's a very strange graphic novel if you've read it, because it has the equivalent of footnotes. There's a section at the end where the warrant for the quotations that are used is given. And in this graphic novel, it's quite graphic. It's about a massacre, so you do see people being massacred. And almost without exception, I think there are about 2 sentences in the entire thing. Almost without exception, it's made up of selections from primary sources. So even though it's a graphic novel, it's a pretty unusual one. But still, it's a different kind of text from the previous 2 that we were looking at. And really interestingly as well, as part of the Age of Revolutions project, which was something the HA were involved in, and there was a teacher fellowship around it. As part of that, the cartoonist involved, though not Robert, produced an alternative version using some of the same images. So this is for schools. This is Peterloo for schools. And it's really interesting if you go inside and look at it in the way that it differs from the graphic novel. It's much shorter. It has a narrative thread organized around one character, so it's much more of a story and so on. So my point is then that there are many, many different types of thing we could use in the history classroom if we were trying to deal with Peterloo. And let's use them to try to understand the difference between evidence and interpretation. And this is where I'm drawing on German ideas. So I'm sorry if you can't see the thing on the right-hand side because of the photographs. It says representations of the past rather than the remains of the past. So if we start from the remains and try and build an account or a representation of the past, then actually I think what we're doing there is what we do almost all the time in history. We try and develop answers to questions about causation, either using primary materials or using the evidence of other people's writing, from which to try and build up by inference and argument a representation of what happened. That's basically what we do most of the time in history. And in Germany, we would be calling this reconstruction. So the idea there is to reconstruct a causal picture, or a picture of change, or some sort of account of the past. Now, this is the bit that you can't see because of the cameras, I think. But deconstruction, right, where what you do now is you work the opposite way. Rather than starting with the traces of the past and trying to build up an account, you start with the accounts other people have produced and work back and ask questions about them. You might want to look back at the relationship between the account and the evidence, but you might not. You might want to look at the relationship between one account and another. So to take the two Peterloo graphic novels, the one for schools and the one for adults, it might be really interesting to compare those, or to compare the graphic novel with the film, or to compare the film with Robert Poole's work, and so on. So I don't know if that makes sense to people, but I quite like it. What are we trying to do? We're trying to build accounts of the past, and we work with evidence, and that would include other people's arguments, to construct pictures of the past or representations of them. What do we do when we do interpretation? We start from not the past itself, but representations of it produced later than the events we're interested in different genres, if we want to go there. I know not everybody does. It might be that we want to just look at interpretations produced in academic historiography. It might be we want to look at the range of things I've been putting out here. What we want to look at is going to be conditioned entirely by our purpose at that moment in our curriculum, isn't it? And by our understanding of what we're doing overall. Okay, so reconstruction is not what I'm talking about today. Deconstruction, understanding how representations are made, why they are made as they are, and various other related questions about representations. That's what I'm on now. Here is something which is much quoted still, which is, I don't know how many Ofsted reports from conference reports from 2004 still get quoted, but this is a really good one. Christine Counsell was there, Michael Riley was there, lots of really excellent people. And out of that conference, we have things like this, which I think are still useful to us now. What's the difference between evidential work and interpretive work? Well, the stuff on the right is the evidential work, and too often it gets confused with the stuff on the left. The classic sort of rookie error, if you like, is the Oliver Cromwell hero or villain, or kind of inquiry. And what that is it's actually very clearly reconstruction, because you give kids sources about Cromwell, you give them historical accounts about Cromwell, and you give them a question, how should we evaluate Cromwell? And you give them this binary category, hero or villain, and they have to reconstruct, a representation of Cromwell of some kind that allows them to answer the question. So that's clearly reconstruction or evidential work. Whereas if you were to say, why has this particular account of Cromwell or Blackadder or whatever it is been shaped in that way? Why is it saying what it says? Then you're actually looking at representations, not the past itself. Okay, hopefully that's all right. Let's move on. Now, I think before we start thinking about what our kids might need, we should think about our own understandings. Why is it that interpretations are plural? Why is it that there aren't many of them? Sometimes people get into quite intricate debates about this. There are people, for example, who call you a relativist and a postmodernist if you want to use interpretations with an S on the end, because they think there should only be one. So we have to decide what our own thinking is about this. And I think it's really instructive to go and look in the past. So I'm very fond of this book. I have a copy of it. Mistakenly, I really foolishly bought it. It cost me £97 when I was an undergraduate, because I thought, isn't this naive? I thought it was the only thing I would really need to go and do my degree. So I get the definitive account and study it, and I'd be sorted. Of course, my supervisors and directors of studies soon disabused me of that. But I have a copy of this. It's the Cambridge Modern History from 1903. And there you can see, what an impressive tome it is, though I don't know how often it gets open nowadays. Lord Acton, who was the guiding mind behind it, he had very interesting ideas here, and it's very much of the spirit of the late 19th century, the time where everyone had been studying von Ranke's seminar techniques and trying to remodel university history on them. And I don't know what you make of this quotation, which you can't actually see. That's annoying, sorry. But what he wanted his aspiration was history ultima, right? Ultimate history, the final, definitive, total account. And he despaired a little bit towards the end of his life. We cannot have it in this generation, right? But we can still have it. It's round the corner. It won't be long before all the information is in, all the sources have been source critiqued. So we've weeded out the dross and the false forgeries and the non-contemporaneous data and so on. When we've got the definitive record, well, then we'll have the ultimate history. This is what Lord Acton wanted. And he writes, in the Cambridge Modern History, expressing this aspiration. This is a quote from him in there. The interesting thing is he died before it was realised, and Mandell Crichton, who was the Bishop of London, but also the Bishop of Peterborough, where I'm talking to you from, and a great medievalist of the Victorian period, wrote something in just after Lord Acton's introduction, which I think is really interesting because it clashes very much with what we think Victorians think. Lord Acton seems like an eminent and typical Victorian, what we would now want to call epistemologically naive. He thinks that we can have the definitive final account of the past once and for all. But contrary to those who think postmodernists are all kind of crazy loonies from the 70s with a Marxist bent, here is a Victorian bishop, unfortunately obscured by our images. But Mandell Crichton, in the same book in which Lord Acton wanted ultimate history, says some really interesting things. What do you make of this? The continual increase of curiosity, the widening of interest, introduces a succession of new subjects for historical research. Documents once discarded as unimportant are found to yield information as to the silent growth of tendencies which gradually become influential. What is he saying there in the book that's supposed to provide ultimate history? He's basically saying that the inquirers, the people who are curious about the past, widen and almost diversify, but he uses the word widen, their interests over time. So even in this book, which is supposed to provide ultimate history, we find an eminent Victorian undermining it. And we can learn a lot from him, I think, about why and how interpretations vary, which is something we need to help children understand. And one of those things, to use a pompous word, is historicity. Anybody is in time. And as time continues to unfold and develop, the sense we make of what is behind us in time changes. A good example of that from my own schooling is in the 1980s, I did my O-level geography in 1983, and it was largely about how impractical and silly hydroelectricity was, and why it was really good to have blast furnaces and nuclear power stations. We didn't know and talk at all about melting ice caps, about the problems with the greenhouse layer and so on. The ozone layer and the greenhouse effect, because none of these things were known. And you just couldn't teach the geography that I learnt at school now, because the future has changed our perspective on the past that brought us from the Industrial Revolution up to that point. That's an example, I think, of some of the sorts of things that Crichton is saying. Here is another example of Crichton's ideas. He's a really sophisticated man, I think. In sciences which deal with nature, the object of research is fixed and stable. It is only man's power of observation that increases. We'll change that to humans' power of observation that increases. But history deals with a subject which is constantly varying in itself and which is regarded by each succeeding generation from a different point of view. So why is it there's more than one historical account? What is the difference between what you encounter in history and what you encounter when you change corridors after break to learn about the ozone layer or whatever? The difference is that the subject matter that is also the inquirer, that human beings are inquiring into each other, humans' ideas change, human cultures change. So our object of study changes, but we ourselves also change over time, which again, I suppose, is linked to this idea of historicity. And finally, as well, just to show you how much I admire the Bishop of Peterborough and London from the 19th century, what about this? In the vast and diversified area of modern history, the point of view determines the whole nature of the record, or else the whole work sinks to the level of a mass of details uninformed by any luminous idea. The writer who strives to avoid any tendency becomes dull, and the cult of impartiality paralyzes the judgment. Now, this is entirely the opposite of what you're supposed to say according to the textbooks if you're an eminent Victorian. You're supposed to believe that total objectivity, which means emptying yourself of any of your prejudices or ideas, will allow you to see the object as it is in itself. And that will give you the truth, the ultimate history. But Mandell Crichton is saying, the point of view determines the whole nature of the record. What an amazing thing. What is he actually saying? I think he's saying the question you pose shapes the answers you get. And he's very much aware that history cannot be final, definitive, and finished once and for all, because we change, humans change over time, our interests change, the questions we ask change. So my point is then we need to think about interpretation ourselves before we try and teach it to kids. But the rest of my presentation is really about why kids might find all this difficult and what we can do about it. And I'm just mindful that I need to get that finished in half an hour. So I'm going to try and speed up now. Okay, so why do children find interpretations difficult? My research is mostly post-16. So if anyone's thinking, oh, this is a bit off the scale, I apologize. I haven't done this work on interpretations with year 6, for example. So, okay, so I'm talking about sixth formers here, but I hope some of this resonates. In my research, I found the thing at the top, subjectivism, to be really important. So in a way, what I'm getting at here is they've got ideas about knowledge, and one of them is to do with subjectivism, and I'll elaborate that in a minute. Another one is epistemic ideas, ideas about how history is made. And in my data, again and again and again, and this echoed findings by Peter Lee and findings by other people, including Dutch and American researchers, kids had a naive idea about how you use documents, a testimonial model of the past. And it was also apparent, I'm afraid, and I should have been ashamed of this because I was the history teacher, that most of the students I was working with really hadn't had much encounter with authentic work on interpretation. So I think then, and this is just a proposition for you, it's not definitive, there'll be other perspectives, I'm sure, but if you're going to try and improve your kids' ideas, you need to think about how they think about knowledge. Those are the subjectivism and the testimony, but you also need to provide them with really rich and frequent encounters with examples of this stuff that you deconstruct, to go back to that language. If you do that, they're likely to change their ideas about epistemology. I conjecture, I can't prove that, because I haven't done the studies yet that would show it. My studies were largely descriptive. Okay, what do I mean by subjectivism? This is Jerry Halliwell. I heard this on the radio in 1999, rushed out to Boots and wrote it down. And then I've used it ever since. You can't read that, I'm afraid, but she says, no two people see the world in the same way. Everybody's truth is different. This is my truth. Right? That is, if you like, what you could call contemporary subjectivism, the idea that there's no such thing as a stable reality, there are merely different perspectives. And the best you can do to arrive at truth is to collect them all. Now, what's right and what's wrong with that? I mean, obviously people do see the world in the same way, but here's why I think that's a problem. This is one of my students. I asked them why interpretations might differ, and I'll read that out for you because you can't see it all. And I'm also going to need to open an alternative copy so I can see it all myself. But they have got quite sophisticated ideas, I think you'll agree. You can tell they've studied history. Here's what they say. They're answering the question, why is there more than one interpretation? If you are a feminist, for example, then you are going to see the suffrage movement in a much different way to if you are a conservative man. So they've got positionality, ideology, where you're located in the present. You think, okay, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to try and show that men were dominating and repressing women. You're obviously going to try and find and interpret the information that you were given as that perspective. You're going to see what you want to see. That's what I mean by subjectivism. You're going to take the information and present the information that upholds your side of the argument and ignore everything else. Now, this is a very capable student who'd been through history education up to A level, and I can't remember whether they got an A or a B, but they were pretty good. And really, I don't know how you react to that, but that's quite depressing, I think, that you can go through history education, you can get good results, you can even go on to study at university with this kind of view that all it is people exercising their opinions like dogs in the park, and Michael Oakeshott talks about that, the whippets in the park. You can say what you like, you can impose your views however you like. That's just what we do. So subjectivism, we need to challenge that. What's wrong with that? The first thing is that it's right. Of course, historians are people. Of course, we're men or women or whatever, however we identify in terms of our sexuality and personal identity, which may, of course, change over time and so on. So, of course, that's true. Of course, historians are conservative or liberal or whatever. Of course, we've all got obsessions. All of that's true. So there's a grain of truth in this. But on the other hand, it's really inadequate to the task, because not only do we have these identities, you have to adopt an approach, you have to adopt a research strategy if you're going to do some history. So as well as the identity, there has to be the methodology, and we have to help children understand that. And we would hope that they would bring that up when we talked about why histories vary. There's more, of course. But not only that, you can't write what you like. If only you could, it would be really easy. I could, do all my work by just waking up one morning and riffing whatever was on the top of my head and publishing that. But you can't, can you? Because all academic research that's produced in peer-reviewed journals or in academic presses is scrutinized blindly by other people working in the field, who give you one hell of a hard time if they think you haven't read their work, haven't read all the sources, have been rash in your inferences. So, going back to that student of mine, they had no idea that history was this interpersonal practice where there was this thing called peer review. They just thought it was, wild subjectivity. Well, it is subjectivity, but it's got to be disciplined by methodology, and you can be sure it's going to be disciplined, scrutinized, critiqued by other people working in the same field. Not only that, of course, as a historian, you really can't go beyond the evidence. You can argue beyond it, you can infer from the evidence, but if there is no evidence, I'm afraid you've just got to follow Wittgenstein and be silent, right? So they don't really realize that either. So I think we need to find ways to help children understand all of that. The history is interpersonal, the objectivity comes from the scrutiny of your peers, it's bound by the evidence and constrained by it, as well as enabled by it. No matter what your personal feelings are, you can't do history without developing some method of research. And when we want to talk about variation in histories, we can talk about variations in the methods and various other things, as we'll see. Okay, I'll skip that. The next thing to mention is these ideas about epistemology. Now, people often say, let's stop talking about skills and blah, blah, blah. But what I want to urge on you is this idea. Everybody has a tacit idea in their mind about how knowledge is constructed. We need to change many of the ideas that kids bring to class about how knowledge is constructed. This is, if you like, disciplinary knowledge. How do they think historians make the claims that they make? I'm going back to one of my students. I have to read this to you again because it's not fully visible. So this is, again, this person did get an A, right? So this is an A grade history student. Now, what's wrong with this? History is retrospective. We rely on reports and accounts from which we may interpret. It is often difficult to ascertain an author's point of view or obtain information about his social standing or political ideas. This means that an historical event or period often has differing accounts due to bias. That's interesting, by the way. They're talking about accounts rather than sources there, but anyway. Bias could be due to political views, personal experience, or any number of other reasons. So they've got this notion that we look back on the past, we use evidence, we can't go and visit the past. That's quite sophisticated. But then they stumble up against this idea that the evidential record is produced by people who have biases and agendas. And we can't tell what they are, they're saying. I would dispute that, actually. We can probably, can't we? But they're saying it's not always absolutely certain what their agendas are. So we can't trust them. Just to carry on. This means that historians today are faced with different interpretations of the same account, and so they must decide which is to believe. I think that is really important, and the crux, really, of what's wrong with their thinking, in my opinion. Let me read that to you again. Historians are faced with different interpretations of the same account, and they must decide which is to be believed. This is pure testimony. It's the idea that you find out about the past by finding a witness who will tell you the truth. as if there is, one perspective which yields the total truth, as if there is one universal truth that will answer all questions. This is really, really, really naive epistemically, in terms of their understanding of knowledge. They don't really know how historians make the claims that they make. They think you go and find the true version in one or other true account, and you just put it in your book. But if we carry on, you see their distrust of the sources extends to historians. So they duplicate the idea in the previous one of subjectivism. Even the modern historians are subject to bias. So I would say that this student really doesn't understand very much at all about how history is created. They know there are sources, but they don't understand how we use them. They think you use sources as cut and paste pieces of the truth, not as something that you might interrogate, something from which you might infer a new truth or a claim of your own. Okay, so we need to sophisticate kids' ideas about how you use evidence. Here's what's wrong with that. We don't cut and paste the truth. Historians interrogate sources and make conclusions by reasoning. There are many things in history for which we could not ask witnesses. Obviously, witnesses are important. Testimony has got a grain of truth in it. But you can't ask somebody, okay, on what day did the Neolithic end? There are some things which cannot be witnessed. And many of the things that interest historians cannot be witnessed. No one saw the causes of the First World War. Right? You can't witness half the stuff we care about. And yeah, so that's the same point again, I apologize. This is really important. This goes back to what I was saying about the Industrial Revolution. It's not as if, anyway, there was a fixed meaning of the past. No one at Peterloo knows the answers to all the questions that Robert Poole's asking in his book. The questions weren't even formulated then. He's really interested, for example, in gender aspects of Peterloo. People didn't ask about that, at that time very much. Historians in the future will want to know things about Peterloo that we couldn't even think about now. So the idea of a fixed meaning of the past, which is what you have to have if you're going to have testimony, is embedded there and is also problematic. So we need to change that. And also, if you think history is all about testimony, you miss out things like that Peterloo banner. You miss out things like fragments of pottery. You miss out things like the archaeology of Auschwitz. There are so many things from which we can construct knowledge which are in no way witnessable. They are the remains rather than reports. And we don't just ask literal questions. Yeah? As I said, it's about inference history, isn't it? About interrogation of material to draw conclusions in relation to questions. So final thing then is that I think a lot of these ideas would go if we expose children regularly and frequently to inquiries into the past. The more you know about, the more examples you've got in your mind of how people do this, the better your understanding will be of what it is they do. It's fairly obvious, isn't it? And here is what I think they do, and I'm afraid some of this will vanish, but okay, we want to know about the past in history, don't we? And what I'm trying to elaborate here, I think, is quite different from what lots of kids think. So we have to try and move them towards something more like this. We want to know about the past. We have a problem. It does not exist. It is gone. It is in the past. What we have are traces. We have relics of the past, things like that banner, and we have reports, let's say that cartoon, or a witness saying what happened from their point of view on the field at Peterloo. Now, what's hidden underneath our photographs is the word historians. Right? So historians want to try and work out what happened in this absent past, the thing that's crossed off, and they do so by asking questions. Now, kids often don't know this. They think you just walk out there and bump into the stuff you put in a book. Of course, what you do, what you go and bump into is going to be shaped massively by what it is you're asking. So we need to teach them that. What questions do historians ask? Do they ask different questions? What are they interested in? But questions aren't enough because you need to have a strategy to answer them. So let's say I'm interested in, gender in Peterloo. Well, what archive am I going to go to? When I go to that archive, what question am I going to ask? And how am I going to answer it? Am I going to answer it by using data mining and go through all the documents looking for gendered pronouns? Some people do that in nowadays. Or am I going to simply read through the trials and see if I can find examples of women on trial or women witnesses? How am I going to do it? I've got to have a strategy. And if we acquaint children with differences in research strategy, different things historians do to answer their questions, surely that's going to help them understand why there might be one account. But not just that, we have to derive our claims, right, from the past, which means use the information we gather in the archive to ground conclusions. That is what evidence is. Evidence is data from the past used to support or to challenge a conclusion. So what we've got here is a reasoning process that we need to help communicate and give kids lots of examples of. If we don't show them historical reasoning, how can we expect them to appreciate the historian's reason? Do you see where I'm coming from on this? So I think something like this, and it's going to say claims there, claims about the past. Something like this is the sort of model of historical epistemology that we need to develop. And obviously this is very simplistic. I've just got historians as if they just wander around the place rather than live in debates and live in arguments with a history and so on. There's much more to say, which is why I began this whole presentation by saying there's more to it than what I'm saying. This isn't simply my approach. But I think the epistemology of it is absolutely vital. And if we don't do that, we're in a hiding to nothing, because the subjectivism, the testimonial common sense that you saw in those really rather talented A-level students will persist all the way through their schooling, and they'll really come out at the end of it not understanding what this thing called history is, which would be quite depressing. Okay, so here are some ideas. How can we do this? How can we move kids on? Well, one idea, and it's only one, and you might not want to do it all the time, but let's think about purposes. Why are people approaching the past? Maybe this is more to do with the wider sense of interpretations, the Peterloo cartoons and film than the history books. But I think it applies to history too in a number of ways. So what I would do is spend a lot of time using concrete examples of things which very obviously take a different approach to the past. This is in Dalton Square in Lancaster. I don't know if anyone here is from Lancaster, but it's one of my favourite parts of the town. And this is put up by the town council to commemorate Queen Victoria. And you can ask, what approach to the past is this taking? And it's fairly obvious, isn't it? But it might not be to kids unless you get them to deconstruct it and look at how it's put together. And there's a lot to be done with that. So if you look round it, you'll see the four graces. You've got truth, and justice, and so on. Sitting round underneath Queen Victoria, you then have panels of eminent Victorians underneath it, and you can infer from who they are quite a lot about values. I don't know if you recognise any of these people, but I can see Gordon of Khartoum with his standing like that, kind of with a philosophical pose. But the interesting thing is they're all men, aren't they? There's only one other woman on this entire monument, apart from the symbols of virtue, and that is Florence Nightingale. What we've got is we've got lawyers, we've got politicians, we've got generals. So what we can say then is mounted on the four graces, we have, and sitting on top of all these really powerful men who are inventors and politicians and lawyers and generals, we have the Queen who's on top there, celebrated and monumentalized. Now, this all may sound quite obvious, but how about if we make some comparisons to look at other purposes of the past? I don't know if people have been here. I used to go with my A-level students studying Nazi Germany, and I really recommend it, by the way. If you don't want to go to Berlin, go to Nuremberg, because there's so much there. But this is the Nazi Party Congress Hall, unfinished. It's supposed to be the Colosseum replica thereof. And what to do with it was a question after the war. Do you keep it because it's an obscenity? It's built with the blood of labourers from Mauthausen Quarry and so on. And it was there to celebrate the 1,000-year Reich. Do you do something with it? Do you destroy it? What do you do with it? And what I really like is what they did do with it in the end eventually, which is this. They fired the arrow of enlightenment into the building in order to pierce Albert Speer's symmetry. Okay, and in this arrow you have a documentation centre. I don't know if you can see, but the stairs are supposed to be the fletch of the arrow, as is the awning over the stairs. So this is very literally a building pierced by an arrow that is a building. And in this arrow is the documentation of fascination and terror. So here it is coming right through into the middle, piercing the building. You go in and you end up at the arrow point coming into the building itself, mortally wounding its symmetrical lies or something. Here is the fascination, the masses saying "Ya" and so on. And here is where it all ends up after a journey of terror, with death, with humiliation for the Reich, and so on. So one thing, I don't know what you think of that, but let's engage with different purposes in approaching the past. And if you think, that isn't what academic historians do, well, I want to suggest that they do, to a lesser degree, obviously. I mean, and one of my favourite works of history that I know the HA were debating online in Twitter not long ago is The Making of the English Working Class. And it's quite apparent that Thompson is trying to rescue, as he puts it, the poor Stockinger and the Luddites from the contempt of history. And there's definitely a monumentalizing, doing justice to history angle to that work. So historians have purposes as well as monument builders, and monuments help kids notice this. That's my contention. Let's hope there's something in it. The other thing which I think is interesting is just thinking about the psychology of meaning making. So I'll just skip over this bit. Human beings basically make meaning. This is a quote from the art historian and historian in the sense of the short history of the world, E.H. Gombrich. Groping comes before grasping, seeking before seeing. Right? The human mind imposes meaning on the world. Let me show you examples of that. Kids have great fun with this. What do you see? You ask them. This is a Rorschach blot. The answer is there's nothing there at all. It's just a random ink blot. But because we're people, we can't help but find meaning in it. I don't know what you see. I see a woman with big hair skipping. Other people see skulls and so on. Psychologists enjoy, or used to enjoy more in the 50s, I think, inferring things about you from what you see. If you see a skull, they would draw conclusions they wouldn't draw if you saw someone skipping. But the point is, we like to impose meaning. Here's another example, and I'd like you to just do this to see what happens, and maybe you can, I don't know whether there's any way of feeding back to Sam on what the outcome is. Okay, everyone's got to write down exactly what they see. I'm going to show it to you for a few seconds at the longest. So are you ready with a pencil? Okay. So I'm going to ask you what's on this gravestone, and I want you to write it down. And then I predict, and this is when I could fall flat on my face, but I predict that 80% of you will get it wrong. Okay. Please write down what you see. So usually what happens when people see this is they think, aha, a psychological trick is being played on me, unless they're year 7 maybe. And so people look for something unusual. Yeah? But what happens then actually, because there is something unusual and a trick is being played on you, is there are 2 tricks. So people tend to stop at the first one and go, sorted. I know they're trying to trick me, but I won't be had. Well, here is what it says. And as I said, I expect, I could be wrong, most of you have made at least one mistake, because it says, here lie the bones of Davy Jones. Most people get that wrong, and the reason is quite simple. Again, human beings expect things to have the patterning that they're looking for. So when you're asking, why do historians find the things that they find, partly one should ask, what is it they're trying to do, which is the one about purposes. But you should also ask what assumptions they have about what's important, what assumptions they have about what's worth inquiring into. And I think you can see that that's going to explain quite nicely why, if you're looking, let's say, at the historiography of the Peterloo massacre, why it is people didn't used to ask about the women. Because before second wave feminism in the 1960s, unfortunately, historians generally didn't think it was important to ask about women. So there was an assumption there in the minds of the historians which prevented them from recognizing patterns in the archival data that people now spot. Davy Jones, of course, to people of my age, and I'm ancient, is a member of the Monkees, but to my kids' generation, he's someone else, showing you another aspect of assumptions. Another thing that's quite useful for that is this exercise, which I can't show it to you because I don't know how to use a video in Zoom, but I don't know if people have seen this. It's called an attention experiment. If you Google for it, you'll find it. It's quite classic. It's to do with direction and what you notice. So if people say, look for one thing, you tend to miss something else. The task here is to count the number of times the players in the white pass the basketball. You watch these players for about 20 seconds, they pass the ball, you count it. And often people are so focused on getting it right that they do. It tends to be more like 15 or 16, or 14 or 16 than 15. But nevertheless, you know, people are quite pleased and they've got it right. But then comes the question, did you see the gorilla? And there is a gorilla who just walks out into the middle and hammers his chest and then walks off again. And most of the time people don't see it. The point being that when you're looking for one thing, you tend not to notice other things, which again, I think is the point about inquiry. So we should ask, and if we're going to try and get periodization focused and history focused here, what is it, you know, let's say that people in the 60s were minded to be asking? What were the questions that were driving them and shaping their attention? And what did they find in the archive that people aren't finding now because they're driven by different assumptions and different questions and so on? That's how I would actually put this to use. But I don't know whether you think it's acceptable to do psychology things in history. If not, fair enough, but I did anyway. This brings us to the question. How can we help kids to understand that historians have different questions? It's a bit difficult because a history book is a big thing. And you know, sometimes they wear the question on the front, but often they don't. So how do we do that? Well, here's a suggestion. I mean, again, it's only the beginning because you want them to actually read the books. But how about this? I just went on Amazon. I'm afraid I've been addicted to it since 1999. And had a look for books on the French Revolution and then used them with my kids. So here is one. You know, you could ask your kids, all right then, just from the title of this book, tell me something about the question the historian is asking. So Citizens, it's called, A Chronicle of the French Revolution. You'd probably have to explain that, wouldn't you? What is a chronicle? What is a chronicler? It's one way of doing history. And what questions do chroniclers ask? Well, they tend to ask questions about, you know, what happened first, what happened next, what is the narrative? And that's what I would expect to find in this book. And of course, it is what you find in the book. But there's a lot else going on. But you find basically a narrative of the French Revolution, don't you? Focusing on key actors, the citizens, and what they did and why. This, however, is a very different book. The Origins of the French Revolution by William Doyle. I actually used this for my A-levels as it happens. This is a causal inquiry, isn't it, into the French Revolution. So you're going to expect to find something really rather different in this book to what you'd find in Charman. And that's true, actually, because it's just about the origins. You find out very little about the revolution itself in Doyle's book. The focus is different, but the inquiry is also different, and that shapes what's going on. Women of the French Revolution is, again, asking a different question to the origins of the French Revolution, as is the book A People's History of the French Revolution, which starts to bring in a history from below Marxist perspective. This is an interesting one. What's going on here? This is very much, I think, a post 9/11 book. You know, rather than asking about the crowd and so on in the way that Marxist historians from below does, this book is really perplexed by the troubling question: how could people become terrorists and say, you know, terror is the order of the day, as Robespierre and all these other people did? So we've got a different sort of question. Why is it that terror arose? Why did these people, you know, adopt this strategy and so on? So I don't know what you think of this, but and you can go further, by the way. You can go look at the cover and line it up with the Amazon blurb. Here is the blurb for Choosing Terror. And, you know, maybe if I was doing an inquiry into interpretations of the French Revolution, we could ask kids to evaluate these books. You know, we want to know about changing views on X. Which of these books will help most with that? And obviously you're going to want to read some of these, aren't you, and get inside them. So this is deliberately superficial. But the point is that I think if you want to get the understanding that questions might differ, how do you do that without reading the whole book? Okay, I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to have to get on with this and not do everything I hope to do. What about going beyond this? And I'm just going to tell you about a marvelous piece of work that Kate Hammond has done. So this is not me at all. But I don't know if you haven't read Kate Hammond's article from 2007 in Teaching History about understanding historians' theories and methods. You haven't lived, in my opinion, interpretations-wise. It's simply the best thing there is, practically. Superb, in my opinion. And what does it do? It basically tries to convey to kids research strategy and gets them successfully, it's really impressive, to think about the uses and limitations of different research strategies. Now, you know, how good is that? The more we do that, the more children will realise that when presented with different historical interpretations, one should ask, how have they gone about answering their question? because how they've gone about it is going to have a profound effect on what they say. So what Kate Hammond does is compare cliometrics, which is the statistical modeling of history, counting stuff. It's basically economic history using what we would now call big data. You gather vast archives of stuff, in this case about slavery, and you ask questions about, what houses did slaves live in, how much meat did they eat, how frequently did they get potatoes, how long did they live, how many children do they have. You put together all this data. And what Kate Hammond says to her kids is, in this article, all right then, what are the uses and limitations of doing that? What are you going to notice and what are you going to miss about slavery if you just focus on big data type issues? So for example, this is the distribution of slaves in slave houses, how many people there were in the houses. Here's another one, the comparison, and this is why this book was really controversial, by the way, because it kind of argued that slavery was better than not being a slave. I mean, how shocking is that? But yeah, total consumption of slaves versus non-slaves. Notice that the non-slave diet is larger. Notice that the consumption of grain is larger, but the consumption of meat is lower. You can get into all sorts of trivial arguments about whether it's more important to have meat than grain, but this is what cliometrics is. What do you miss and what do you see if you do that? And you compare that with microhistory. I don't have the right books here actually, but things like Frederick Douglass or 12 Years a Slave. Microhistory gives you one individual as a lens into a wider context. And what do you see and what do you miss if you take Olaudah Equiano, for example, as your and the study of his autobiography as your optic through which to understand slavery. I don't know what you think of that, but I really recommend reading the article, and it is brilliant because it draws out how easily you can do this. Finally, and then I'll stop, I think also we should talk about theory. So let's get inside the conceptual apparatus that people use. And I'm going to have to do this one really, really quickly. The way I've done this is using something pinched from a sociologist. And I used to teach in Cornwall, and I was doing in Truro when I did it. And there's a very simple question, which is you just ask why people might come up with different answers to a simple question. So the question is, go into Lemon Quay, which looks like this if you want to know what it's like. It's an open square surrounded by buildings and a car park and a Marks and Spencer's, etc. And so you ask your two researchers, you send two teams out to ask how many people there are in Lemon Quay. And the problem is they come back with wildly differing answers. How do we account for that? So here it is. I send them into Lemon Quay at the same time on the same day to count the number of people there at 11:57. They come back with very, very differing answers. One of them says 267.5 people were in Lemon Quay. One of them says 1,756 people were in Lemon Quay. How do we solve this? I've written about this in Teaching History. There's a piece from 2011 on it. Forgotten what it's called. But the point is, it all depends on how you define various things. What is a person? What is Lemon Quay? Right? There is no doing of even the simplest task without theoretical definitions. And you can then debate with your class, what is a reasonable definition of a person? The red team have half a person. Is that because they're counting a pregnant woman? Or, what is it if someone's half in and half out of the square? What is the square? How do we define that? The square contains a car park. Is everybody in the car park in a car in Lemon Quay? Are the people in the shops in Lemon Quay? So it's a fairly trivial thing, but it makes a really obvious point, which is you cannot do the simplest task, let alone a sophisticated, challenging one like reasoning about causality, without having theory. And we need to know what theoretical ideas the historians have. To bring that home and to use it in a historical context, this is the first and most famous British political photograph. It's the Chartists on Kennington Common. And there is a really massive debate among historians about how many Chartists were on Kennington Common in 1848. And it matters because it helps you answer the question, was there a revolutionary situation in England in 1848? So, having done Lemon Quay, ask your kids, how do we count Chartists? Is this a Chartist, right? they've got one of those coal bearers hats on, I think. No, that's a top hat. Okay. So they're quite near the podium. Are they a Chartist? The people on the podium, are they Chartist? And what you can't see is someone in a Hackney carriage. So he's probably a taxi driver. Are they a Chartist? Well, probably not. But how do we decide, who is and who isn't a Chartist in an image like this? Does simply attending the event make you one? In other words, what theoretical definition of Chartist are you going to have to deploy to do this elementary task? Also, where does Kennington Common end? If I'm in the mill, am I in the common? Or do I have to be bang in the middle of it? And before you can even answer the more interesting historical questions, you have to sort out these conundrums. A more interesting question would be, how radical are they? Is this a revolutionary situation? How do we know? I'll stop there because otherwise I shall overrun massively. But just in summary then, what I'm trying to do is highlight some of the things I think are challenging for children about understanding historical interpretations and point to some of the things we're going to have to teach them. Now, some of them, like this theoretical point, they sound a bit abstruse. They sound a bit abstracted from talking about William the Conqueror, but we can do it. It's not that hard. That's a good line to stop on, isn't it? I'll stop. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. Thanks very much, Arthur. That was absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure I echo everyone else in saying that. There has been a couple of questions as you've gone. First one is from me, and this is probably quite an easy question. You mentioned obviously Kate Hammond's article. I'm assuming that's in Teaching History.
It is. It's in Teaching History for 2007.
Cool.
I don't remember exactly which edition, but I love it because of what it does and because of its title. It's called, teaching children, something like teaching children about historians' theories and methods. And we need to do more of that. That's my main claim.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to go away and read it. The other question was, sorry, I'm just finding it in my notes. The other question was from Rose Goodhart. She asked a question about this book, so I've run out and grabbed a prop as you've been talking, Arthur. So I'm sure lots of people have come across this. I know there was an article in Teaching History about it, I think last year, which was...
I haven't read it.
It's good. It's interesting, certainly. The question was just around, and I'll read it out directly. If you can't go beyond the evidence, then what do we think about John Hatcher's The Black Death? He wrote an intimate story of a village crisis of Walsham. So just to fill you in, Arthur, it's kind of half a narrative, half a kind of historical novel based on research that John Hatcher did into the village. And obviously, as a result of that, he admits really that he invents some situations and dialogue. Would you argue that this isn't historically valid? Or what are your thoughts on
my opinion about that is the same as my opinion about anything really, which is you can do what you say you're going to do, right? So if he claims that what he's presenting in every single statement in the book has the same epistemic status, then I think he probably needs taking to task. But if he recognizes that some of this book, some of this material, what one can really claim to know with confidence, and other things are justifiable speculations, and as long as that's clear, I think that's fine. But I mean, a good example like that, I don't know if people know Simon Sharma's book, Dead Certainties. I love it because of the title. Dead Certainties, Unwarranted Speculations, right? It's a book in which he explicitly makes stuff up, and he says he's doing it. And people really gave him a hard time about it. I think he wishes he'd never written it, but I think it's fine if you say, okay, in this book, here are the things which I'd stake my reputation on as a historian, and here are what I would call plausible construals of what might have been the case. And what you find is people use language to reflect that, don't they? I hope that book does. I mean, people use modality, might have been, probably, we can expect, we can fairly reasonably claim, etc. So I think you'd see the differences in epistemic certainty in the language, and why not get the kids to see that, and why not ask them to use degrees of certainty in their own writing?
Excellent, thank you. Just while we've been talking, somebody, Sean, I think, very kindly has said us in Teaching History 128 for that article we were talking about. So thanks very much. Just one more question. As is tradition, we are overrunning, as these things always do, but we will make sure we've asked all the questions. So this one is just from Mitch, and he says, Arthur, do you think we should explicitly and repeatedly teach students about the way in which historians work, starting at Key Stage 3? And he suggests that perhaps we could frame inquiry questions in such as, why does X argue Y?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's like going back to my students and those quotations, which really depress me because they show that they have no epistemic understanding of history. I mean, in a way, you don't need to, right? You can get, I mean, unless the specs have changed massively, I think you probably still can get a good grade whilst having crazy ideas about how history works. But personally, I'm dissatisfied with that, and I'd be pushing the exam boards to change such that you cannot get a good grade unless you really know. But why does it matter? You know, I mean, we don't have to get too sanctimonious about it, but you know, it really matters that we know the grounds of what we claim. You know, I think to be a responsible individual, you need to have epistemic warrant. You know, you need to have good grounds for what you say, and you need to be schooled in asking, what grounds has that person got for what they claim? So those are general citizenship-oriented reasons why it's important. But I think you don't understand what history is unless you know how it has been made. And we need to be teaching people that from the off. If you leave it till they're, you know, till they're post Key Stage 3, they'll have missed that out in their education. They may never think about historical truth again. You know? So definitely from the start, for sure, in my opinion.
Excellent, thank you.